Trigger warning. This podcast episode contains discussions of a sensitive nature, including miscarriage, that may be triggering for some individuals.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast in partnership with Kidney Care UK, sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.
Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. My name is Dee Moore, and I am a kidney warrior. This podcast is dedicated to encourage, educate, and inspire as we explore all aspects of kidney disease, related chronic illnesses, and health. If you have any questions or ideas for topics you would like me to cover, please get in contact with me on social media using the handle Diary of a Kidney Warrior. Continuing with the topic of pregnancy and CKD, in today's episode, I'm bringing you a kidney warrior story. Now, there's always something you can learn from someone's story, something that can bring inspiration and hope. My guest today from Bromley, England, is osteopath, Pilates instructor, author, and mum of 2 children, George and Rosa, Kay Allardyce. Kay shares her inspirational journey of receiving a kidney from her mother and navigating family planning, pregnancy, and childbirth while living with CKD. Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. How are you doing today, Kay?
Very well. Thanks for having me on, Dee.
You're so welcome. Everyone knows what I'm going to say because I say it every time, but I do sincerely mean it when I say that I absolutely enjoy recording Kidney Warrior story interviews because, as I've said many times before, you can learn so much from someone's lived experience with CKD. It's so powerful. And so I'm always excited about recording Kidney Warrior story interviews. And there's a second part to this interview. We're also going to take a closer, more in-depth look about pregnancy and CKD. We looked at pregnancy in a previous episode. Dr. Taryn Pyle joined me on the podcast, episode 48, and do check out that episode. It's really nice to be able to have a discussion with a kidney warrior about this. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the second part of the interview too. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my first question. And my first question is, how did your kidney warrior journey begin and how were you diagnosed?
So my kidney warrior journey started at the age of 24. I took a flight to Italy for a wedding, came back, realised my ankles were quite swollen, and it took me about 2 weeks to actually get myself to the GP about it. I just thought, they went down and then they came back up again. I thought, maybe this is going to go away, and it didn't. So I took myself to the GP and basically they did my blood pressure. It was sky high. And so I was sent off to St. George's to the hypertensive unit there. And it was a bit of a cascade from there. I had some further tests done and came about that I had kidney issues. I then had a biopsy done and I was diagnosed with Focal Segmental Glomerulosclerosis, an autoimmune type kidney disease, which was obviously a bit of a shock at 24. But from there, obviously put on quite a lot of medication to try and control my blood pressure and try and help sort of the kidneys. And it was then really that my kidney warrior journey started. Yeah.
So getting this diagnosis out of nowhere really must have been a massive shock to the system. So what was life in the beginning stages after receiving the diagnosis?
Well, I was pretty disappointed. I mean, the first thing I thought was, how am I going to tell my parents? I mean, I've always been quite a studious person. I've always wanted to do well. I studied, I became an osteopath. I was in my sort of second year of clinical practice, and I just thought, oh gosh, I just felt this huge disappointment in myself because I thought, how have I ended up with this? I was always trying to lead a really healthy lifestyle. I ate well. Obviously, as a student, I'd sort of have a few evenings out with my peers, but I was always quite considered. So yeah, I just like had felt a massive blow really about it. And obviously when I did tell my parents, they were really worried about it. But yeah, I suppose I felt quite cheated by it, because as I say, I'd tried to lead a healthy lifestyle and all of a sudden it was there. And I remember the consultant saying, in a way, it's a blessing that your body has given you some symptoms, because in some cases you can go into complete renal failure without getting many symptoms at all. And so, that was a bitter pill to swallow, really. But yeah, so pretty devastated at the time. Yeah.
So you spoke about the disappointment that you felt with the diagnosis. Did your feelings change over time? How did your journey continue?
So it took a while. Quite a few months of upset, crying, trying to process it. With my naturopathy background, I felt quite strongly about trying to see if I could deal with it with sort of quite strict diets. And I had some homeopathy. I tried a lot of complementary therapies to see if I could actually heal myself. And I would then have my regular bloods done, and, not a lot would have changed. And so I suppose it was a journey of acceptance, but there was still a sort of a feeling of, disappointment in myself because, I'd graduated a couple of years prior to that. And I felt like my journey as an osteopath was just starting, and it was sort of I wasn't sure what was ahead of me. And I suppose it must have been a couple of years after the diagnosis, I just decided that I wanted to fill my life with as much as possible. And so I asked the practice that I was working in if I could take a sabbatical. And I wanted to just go to Australia. I wanted to just feel like I was doing some traveling. And so I did. I spent 3 months over there. I had a friend in Melbourne who I started off with. And yeah, I just had this real sense that I needed to fill my life if it was going to be affected longer by not being able to travel or do what I wanted to do. So that was kind of one of my sort of processes of trying to sort of deal with it. And so I think learning a lot more about the condition always helps as well. And I found it was a massive learning, and as the years went on and as the kidney function progressed or regressed, obviously dietary changes came about. And so again, you're learning about the function of the kidney, which actually is quite in depth, and why I was put on certain restricted diets. So yeah, massive learning curve, but it was tough. At the time, I wasn't really aware of any counselling services or anything like that. So I got some amazing family. And so I would talk to them about it, but no one else in the family who'd had a chronic illness. So it's quite a niche subject really to sort of talk about. So yeah, I think it was just a time thing, and just to sort of try and process it really.
I think it really is, as I've said before, it's like a grieving process, isn't it? It's like you get this news and then you get hit with all these different emotions, which is so similar to the grieving process. The anger, the bargaining, all that stuff goes through your mind. And so for anyone listening who might have got that shock news and is struggling to come to terms with the diagnosis, what advice do you have for them?
I think for anyone who has had that diagnosis thrown at them, hit them like a punch in the face, I think just talking to people about it, bottling things up is just not the way to go. I think, over a period of time, I personally took away the personal blame there was just no point. I think in some cases these things do happen to people, and there's maybe a long, something beyond that is your reason for it. Maybe there is something going on in the universe, that deeper meaning for it. I think maybe that's another thing that helped me get over it. And there are treatments for it. There's no cure, but it's it's not the end having the diagnosis, but there are treatments, and it's learning about them and making some decisions about them. I think you definitely end up having quite an in-depth relationship with your consultant, because as time goes on, they talk to you about the treatment options, and it's a shared decision making process. So I think talking is probably the best thing, talking to others about what's going on.
So you got this diagnosis, you went through the process of coming to terms with having the diagnosis. What happened next?
So, as I said, I took myself off. I did a bit of traveling. I came back, and funny enough, I actually finished a relationship I was in with somebody and met my now husband, and probably had one of the best years of my life, actually, prior to my kidney function getting to the point where it was discussed that I would possibly need a transplant or go on dialysis. So it took about 5 years to get to that stage, and I had talks about discussing transplant with family and friends. And as I say, I've got a brilliantly supportive family. I've got a brother who's 2 years older than me, and my mother and father both wanted to get tested to see if they could be a donor as well. And so by the age of 29, I was getting prepped to have a transplant at Guy's Hospital, who are absolutely incredible. I mean, they considered it a preemptive transplant because they knew that I would need dialysis, if I didn't have this transplant. And so it was, an incredible journey with them. And my brother was a really good match, and as was my mother. My father, unfortunately, had slightly high blood pressure, so he was gutted to not have been able to be considered. But after, again, some discussions with my consultants, they felt that my mother would be a better option in case I was ever to need a second transplant. And my brother was happy either way. I mean, I was only 29, so I could totally understand where they were coming from. And my mum was a brilliant match and very healthy. So that was the next stage. So as I say, that took about 5 years to get to. But interestingly, in the last the last 3 or 4 months, my periods were very, very sporadic, and I knew my fertility had dropped, but in a very naive way. Because of that, the use of contraception was sporadic. I was also with a new partner, so unfortunately I did actually have a miscarriage about, I'd say about sort of 3 or 4 months before I actually had my transplant, which, was quite a journey to get over, because I should have really had a blood transfusion, but I knew it was something worth trying to avoid before having a transplant for various reasons. And so I had to sort of try and get my energy levels back after that experience before going into having transplant. So definitely one to consider, that even though fertility can potentially be lower if your kidneys aren't working very well, still use the contraception, because things can still happen. Yeah.
I'm sorry for your loss, and for anyone
Oh, thanks, Dee.
for anyone who also has experienced this, my condolences to you also. So how was the actual process of having the transplant itself?
So the process of having the transplant, for me, was gaining a pure gaining experience. I went into it very tired, and obviously, my body wasn't functioning very well at all. And within a matter of days, I felt so much better. I know from pictures and from family saying, I looked better, but I felt better in myself. The first couple of weeks are tough. Your tummy's sore. There's a lot of tests. You're up at the hospital having checkups very, very regularly. But for me, it just felt like the start of a new, it's an amazing gift. My mum, as I said, was my donor. We sort of shared a space in the ward. So her bed was next to mine. And so we very much were together, in the recovery as well. And I think for her, it took her a lot more weeks because, again, her body had lost something, so it had to adjust to that. So it's a fine line. Obviously, I wanted to encourage her with, her rehabilitation. At the same time, I think it's patience. You've just got to give it time. Your body's got to adjust. That's to say, for me, a very, very positive experience. And so much so that by just under 7 months, my husband and I decided we wanted to raise money for Guy's and St Thomas's. So we actually cycled. We took on the challenge of cycling from London to Paris, which was a brilliant goal-setting journey for me with my own health goals. And so, there was no way that was going to be possible before having a transplant. So I felt extremely blessed to have functioning kidney again. Yeah.
So that's a real transformation from being tired to being able to cycle the distance from London to Paris. I mean, that is incredible. And also raising money for such an amazing hospital. So it really goes to show what a difference transplantation makes to people's lives. It not just saves lives, but transforms lives too. So this brings us to the second part of the interview where we're going to look at pregnancy. And as you touched on, even when your kidneys are failing and it would seem that your fertility is decreasing, it is still possible to become pregnant. And so I wanted to talk a bit more about that. So you were in a new relationship, you had your transplant, you're looking at the future, thinking about starting a family. So what was that process like for yourself and for your partner?
So I think I had a brilliant relationship also with my consultant, and I found him incredibly forthcoming with asking the question of my take on family planning and whether I was interested in starting a family. To be honest, it was actually something that we touched on even when I was newly diagnosed, because I think it is a conversation. It is quite a tricky situation because for some people, maybe their function is still good enough to have it prior to getting to the stage of dialysis and a transplant. They maybe, but it's a tricky business, isn't it? Because you're taking it in the factors, your psychosocial factors. Maybe you're not necessarily in a relationship or so. But anyway, at the time, yes, I'd been in a relationship with Tim, and we both would like to have started a family. And I remember the consultant had said to me, really give the new kidney a good year to settle in. So that first year was all about just doing that, really, letting it in bed and getting used to taking my medications. It was, a brilliant year. And interestingly, because I'd started talking to Tim about having children, he then proposed, the traditional man he is, which was very sweet. And so actually the following year, it was all about sort of getting married. So it wasn't until coming up to getting married that I actually spoke again to my consultant. And he said, well, if now is the time where you're really starting to seriously think about it, we need to discuss changing some of your medication. So one of the medications that I was on was MMF. immunosuppressant, and I needed to change that to one called Azathioprine, which is better medication to be on when you're trying to conceive. I think there's some contraindications for MMF on the sort of development of the baby. So I was switched to that. And then, yeah, I suppose it must have been about sort of 4 or 5 months later that I actually fell pregnant, and which was amazing, brilliant, very, I mean, it was like, it was my next personal challenge, really, because I knew that it wasn't going to necessarily be a straightforward pregnancy. I know pregnancy with a kidney transplant is considered, a high risk, but I'd had a fantastic consultation with my consultant and my obstetric physician and an obstetric consultant. They call it a pre-pregnancy counselling, guys. I'm not sure if it's the same everywhere else across the UK, but it's a brilliant resource that we discuss my blood tests, my kidney function, and again, it's a shared decision making process where they say, actually, yeah, you are in a good position, a pregnancy would be viable, and if you want to go ahead, then they give you the thumbs up, and for me they did. So it was a brilliant sort of process, and I felt very, very supported by them. And so, yeah, my pregnancy, I had a brilliant pregnancy. I, went in wanting to know as much as possible about what might lie ahead. I mean, there's more of a risk of things like preeclampsia and possible need for like a cesarean section as a delivery, and possible sort of low birth weight of the baby. But it was a process for me to then start to sort of research what I could do to try and make the birthing process as positive as possible, and try and get to as full term as I could as well. So a few things I looked into. I looked into hypnobirthing, which for me was a brilliant tool. It allowed me to go into that latter stage of pregnancy with a mindset of being less fearful of the delivery process, using sort of positive affirmations and, some mindful breathing techniques. But the other thing also, I wanted to try and stay as physically fit as possible to help with the labour. So I looked into doing some prenatal Pilates and yoga, which again, just I felt sort of put me in good stead. So I really enjoyed my pregnancy. But as I say, there's a lot more consultations with the consultants and the midwives. But every time I got to see the baby on a scan, there was my mum's little kidney there snuggled next to it. So that was incredible to see, actually, that, without it, it's hard to imagine I would have been able to be pregnant. So, yeah, so that was sort of my journey during pregnancy.
That is so incredible. I mean, just touching on what you just said about seeing the baby and the kidney on the scan. I mean, it's really representative of new life, isn't it? That kidney represents new life for you, and then the baby, a new life and a new family. That's absolutely amazing. For anyone listening who is considering starting a family, who has had a transplant or maybe at the stage where they're coming up to their transplant, what advice do you have for them?
So there's a few things to consider. I mean, I really would say number one is talk to your consultant. It's got to be right for you. They know your bloods, they know how well your function is. I was told that my creatinine level would probably change, my base level would change after my pregnancy. Not drastically. They said to me my kidney wasn't in danger, but it's a factor to consider. So definitely talking to your consultant about your feelings about sort of family planning, I would say, would be my number one, because also medication is something that would need to change as well. I mean, I was also put on a low dose aspirin, to try and help with prevention for preeclampsia. and the usual sort of folic acid. But yes, you will be monitored more. There will be more appointments to consider. And I think, having a healthy lifestyle is important for any kidney patient, isn't it? But I think even more so when you're pregnant, you're growing a human, really up your level of being able to sort of decrease stress and, be able to sort of, rest. And so I think that's definitely something to consider as well. That, looking into, as I say, right, for me, I looked into some yoga and Pilates and ways of staying fit and well. And I think you also need to go in with a mindset of there probably is going to be some challenges. I was very, very lucky that both my pregnancies, I managed to get almost sort of full term with both, but it may be that a C-section might be required, or, if preeclampsia comes on, that you need to just take advice from the consultant. So I think going in with an open mind and a good relationship with the consultant and being able to decide what's best for you personally. So that would be my sort of tips for pregnancy. And I think childbirth and having a newborn, for anybody, is tough. But that first few months where you're like a sort of a sitting cow if you're breastfeeding, there's a lot of fluid loss. And I personally didn't realise the amount of hydration that I would need to keep up with. So I think really making sure that your hydration is kept to a really high level would be something to really consider sort of post childbirth as well. But yeah, having plenty of support around you if you can, those first sort of few months, because again, kidney patients, we get tired, still quite a bit. And, throw on top of that sort of 3-hour stints of sleep with a newborn. So, it is tough, but for me, it was well worth it. And I feel really, really blessed that with the gift of my mother's kidney, that I was able to have 2 children who are now 8 and 6. So,
an amazing gift. You touched on my next question, actually, which was around breastfeeding, because obviously you're still going to be on the immunosuppressant medication. So I was going to ask, is breastfeeding still possible? But you've answered that question. So those medications, there's no impact on the baby. They don't go to the baby at all.
So I had a fantastic consultant at King's called Kate Bramham, and she's done a lot of research into breastfeeding. And the conclusion from her study was that there was no significant amount that crosses to the baby when breastfeeding the immunosuppressant. So that was a huge, I was just so, so happy to hear that, because it was something I really wanted to be able to do. And so, yes, I completely embraced it. I probably should have been a little bit more flexible, because again, I think keeping the option open to use some formula as well as breast milk, because, you're tired. If you're not hydrated enough, again, that can affect your flow of milk. So I think not putting the pressure on to exclusively breastfeed, would be another tip that I would give. But yeah, there's been some clinical evidence that basically shows that as a transplant patient taking immunosuppressants, you can still breastfeed.
You went on to have a second baby. How old was your first child when you were planning your second pregnancy?
So George was coming up for 2 when Rosa was actually born, who's my second. Interestingly, she came 5 weeks early. So I got diagnosed with the preeclampsia slightly earlier with her. But I kind of wonder if she knew she was going to have to come out early, because she was good weight. She was still well over 6 pounds, and the labour was started off slightly with her. I had a pessary inserted, and then within a few hours, I went into natural labour with her. And yeah, it didn't take too long for her to come out. And I mean, it was a positive experience because I used my hypnobirthing skills for her as well. And yeah, so, number two there, so there's just under 2 years between them. And yeah, I mean, it's for anyone with two young children, it's tough, it's tiring. But again, if you can recruit some extra help, family, friends, it's doable. But in my second birthing experience, my blood pressure, it took a little bit longer to come down actually. And again, my base level of creatinine took a little drop as well, but still a reasonable level, but it's something to consider. But if ever anyone asks, is that it? Or, you're going to have another one? I always say that's it now, because I feel like I've reached my own personal threshold of comfort with the level of creatinine. And so I think I feel very blessed to have one of each. And for me, that's it for, having any more bubbers.
What would be a key word of advice, like the most important thing that you would share with somebody with CKD who's looking at becoming pregnant?
Yeah, I think the main thing is to discuss how you're feeling with your consultant. They know what your kidney function's like at that point in time, and they will be able to give you medical advice as to, when might be a good time for you to potentially look to fall pregnant, depending on your own situations. But I would say, talk openly to your consultant, because you don't want to miss the opportunity if you're at a key time where it would be a good time to start a family. And if they don't feel comfortable about it, then maybe sort of ask them if there's a consultant who would be, more skilled in discussing your options for family planning as a kidney patient as well. So I think that would probably be my number one, is to discuss it with your consultant and not leave it too late.
I think it really goes back to what you said originally about talking and really not being afraid to have these conversations. I think sometimes people suffer in silence for want of a better expression, but talking really is key. So I know that you're very active online and you have a website. What is the address?
Yeah, so if anyone wants to get in touch, my website is Costeo, so it's kosteo.co.uk. I've also written an article for Kidney Matters recently. I think that's page 16 in Kidney Matters, and I've got a feeling I'm featured next door to your lovely feature as well, your 100 episode feature in Kidney Matters. So yeah, if anyone wants to read a little bit more about my journey, and I've got some top tips on pregnancy after a kidney transplant on there too.
So for anyone who missed that article, it is available on the Kidney Care UK website. And I will put the links to all of that in the description box. So please do check out Kay's website and give her a follow. What is your final word of encouragement for the listeners?
My final word is that getting the diagnosis, it's not the end of the world. I processed it. I have, at 42 years of age, still managed to have a career in what I love. I've had 2 children. There's options. Don't feel like it's the end of the world. There's a lot more places to get advice as well now, to talk to people about your journey. There's many more ways to communicate and not feel alone. So use them. And that's probably what I would say. Keep talking. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me, for sharing your story. Such amazing advice, and for being so open and so honest. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dee. Thanks for having me on. It's been brilliant.
Thank you for listening to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. And don't forget that you can contact me on social media using the handle Diary of a Kidney Warrior. Please do subscribe to the podcast, and please do tell a friend. New episodes of this podcast are released every other Monday. Until next time, take care and choose to live.
Diary of a Kidney Warrior, sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.